Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a deep breath and stepping past the simple arithmetic of budgeting.
Right.
We're tackling the essential economic question that sits at the heart of any of these big policy changes. What are the genuine macroeconomic consequences of a monumental spending shift?
That's right. Our listener has already walked through the basic cost accounting, the simple math of what it takes to dedicate, say, 5% of GDP toward education funding.
Bringing state schools up to the level you see in the private system.
Exactly.
And that number is huge, no matter how you slice it. But today, our mission is different. We're not talking about finding the money. We're talking about what happens to the entire national economy when that kind of restructuring happens. Do we cause inflation? Do we spark some kind of boom? Or do we just redistribute money and wait?
We're going to walk you through the economic plumbing. This dive is about understanding why a massive spending shift, even one fully funded by new taxes, doesn't immediately cause the economy to either seize up or, suddenly solve all its problems.
It's the hidden mechanics.
It's the thermostat and the electrics of the entire house, as our sources put it.
And crucially, we have to keep our eye on three distinct effects. The technical accounting, the immediate short-run tax drag, and then, most importantly, the vastly powerful long-run human capital payoff.
Yeah.
I will admit the short-term story is technical, involves some painful adjustments, but stick with us, because the long term is where the real economic revolution happens.
Because that payoff dictates the prosperity, the productivity, and really the wealth of the next 40 years.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right where intuition often leads people astray. If the government announces it's spending an extra, $150 billion on schools, a massive injection, wouldn't the immediate effect just be an economic boom? Doesn't more government spending automatically mean more growth?
That's the classic Keynesian instinct. And look, it's partially true. Government spending, or IDs, is a component of GDP. But we have to remember the fundamental economic identity. It's a bit of a dry formula, but it's essential here.
GDP equals C plus G plus I plus net exports.
GDP equals C plus G plus I plus XM. And C plus G are the big two, as you say.
The big two.
The whole premise of this deep dive is that this funding is entirely tax-funded. So if you raise G government spending by $150 billion, that's positive, but you can't get that money from nowhere. You have to take it from somewhere else.
And that somewhere else is usually C, consumer spending.
Because taxpayers now have less disposable income. Precisely. For the economy as a whole, it's mostly a reshuffle. You're taking purchasing power out of the hands of consumers and shifting it to the government, who then spends it on the exact same things.
Teachers, school buildings, equipment.
Right. So the initial economic impulse is often close to neutral.
So the economy just sort of sighs and carries on. But wait, if we're pumping that much cash, $150 billion, into hiring and building right away, why don't our sources warn about immediate inflation risk? Wouldn't that be a bigger story?
That's an excellent, necessary question. The risk of major inflation that comes when the economy is already running at full capacity.
When everyone's already working.
Exactly. When unemployment is low, factories are maxed out. In that scenario, new spending just bids up the prices of existing resources. But the UK economy, like many developed economies, it often operates with some slack.
Spare capacity.
Spare capacity. Spending can hire people who are underemployed or bring unused capacity online, empty lecture halls or underutilized construction firms. We're not just chasing the same resources, we're activating latent ones.
Got it. Okay, but let's get to the short-run dip you mentioned. If the effect is close to neutral, why does the analysis show a short-run drag?
This is where the behavioral difference between taxation and spending kicks in via the multipliers.
Ah, the dreaded less fun multiplier.
A tax multiplier. While education spending has a high positive multiplier, you hire a teacher, they spend their salary, the money bounces around. Raising taxes has a negative one, and it's generally stronger in the short run.
Okay.
The literature suggests a tax multiplier of around minus 0.4, meaning every £1 in new tax chops about 40 pence off GDP in the short run. That feels like a real drag. Why is it so immediate?
Because new taxes often hit savings or investment disproportionately money that was potentially going toward future productive economic activity. When you tax that money, you can immediately slow down future investment decisions. You can dampen consumer confidence.
Right.
So if we apply that minus 0.4 multiplier to the rough $150 billion tax bill, you get a short-run GDP drag of approximately $60 billion.
And what about the positive side, the spending?
Well, the immediate positive boost from, say, hiring teachers and repairing infrastructure, that's maybe a positive multiplier of what, 0.16? So you have a $24 billion boost against a $60 billion drag.
So the net effect is a temporary dip.
Exactly. The net effect is a temporary dip of about 1% in GDP. It's an adjustment period. The economy is rebalancing from private consumption to public provision. It is not an economic apocalypse,
No.
but it is the economy, adjusting to its new weight class before the structural benefits really kick in. That slight grumpiness leads us perfectly to another common misunderstanding. The argument that if you create high-quality universal public schools and private schools become unnecessary, then the whole economic contribution of that sector just vanishes.
Yeah, that argument fundamentally misunderstands the reallocation effect. Economic activity doesn't just disappear into a black hole.
Our sources noted that private schools generate significant activity, roughly $16.5 billion a year in gross value added, GVA. If they close or shrink, where does that $16.5 billion in activity go?
It just moves category. Think of it like this. Imagine a fantastic piece of furniture. That's the teaching and the economic activity.
Okay.
Right now, it sits in your personal living room. That's private consumption. But if the state provides a world-class communal library, the public system, and your furniture is now part of that shared collection, the furniture itself hasn't vanished.
The same chair.
It's the same piece of economic activity. It's just move location on the national accounts ledger, shifting from private consumption to public consumption.
So GDP doesn't lose the contribution, it just records it under a different heading. The overall economy barely registers that specific shift.
Correct. The total volume of national economic output is largely unchanged. However, individuals certainly notice the shift, which brings us to redistribution. This is where the economics stops being abstract and starts becoming acutely personal.
Okay, let's break down who feels the change, because this is the root of the political fight.
On one side, parents who are currently paying those enormous private school fees, they gain substantial disposable income, potentially thousands, even tens of thousands of pounds a year.
A massive personal benefit for them.
Huge. On the other side, everyone else pays more tax to fund the universal system.
And who sees the biggest marginal tax increase in a shine this large?
Generally, you need high marginal taxes on high earners to fund something of this magnitude. So the top 1 to 5% of income earners shoulder the largest proportional burden.
So the overall economy barely notices this internal reshuffle.
But for those funding it, or those who no longer have to pay fees, the effect is immediate. It's personal.
And that's the dividing line. That's why, as the evidence suggests, while the short-run economics are manageable, the shift inevitably becomes entirely political.
The analysis provides the data on inputs and outputs, but it's political discourse that determines whether society values that outcome.
Absolutely. But let's move past the short-term grumpiness, past the political friction, because this is the pivot point. This is where we get into the structural economics that justifies the entire exercise.
Yes.
Education investment is one of the few spending categories that delivers sustained, compounding, and just unequivocal economic returns.
This is the human capital effect. And it's critical because it fundamentally alters the long-term productive capacity of the entire nation. We are not talking about a temporary stimulus. We're talking about shaping the economic landscape for generations.
So what does the research show? How does spending money on schools turn into a permanent GDP boost? What are the mechanics?
It works primarily through productivity and innovation. When you lift the floor of educational attainment for every single child, you are creating a workforce that's fundamentally more skilled, more flexible, and more innovative.
They don't just work harder.
No. They solve complex problems faster, they adapt to technological change more easily, and they're significantly more likely to do the kind of high-level, abstract thinking that leads to new patents, new businesses.
So it's not just about getting a better job, it's about generating new industries.
Precisely. And this boost lasts for 40 or more years in the working lives of that generation. On top of that, the societal benefits pile up.
Like what?
Quality schooling correlates strongly with reduced welfare reliance, lower crime rates, and, this is often overlooked, significantly better population health outcomes.
Which means longer, more productive working lives and less pressure on healthcare.
Exactly.
And we have hard data linking improved educational outcomes directly to national income, right?
The academic literature is crystal clear on this. Even a modest improvement in national test scores, say, a quarter of a standard deviation, which is achievable, is associated with a massive, sustained, permanent increase of 3 to 6% in long-run GDP.
Let's translate that into real terms. We're talking about an annual cost of what, 150 billion? If outcomes are genuinely lifted, that long-run GDP gain could be 5 to 10% higher than the do-nothing path.
That's 150 billion to 300 billion every single year, growing perpetually.
The numbers just speak for themselves. The long-run gain absolutely dwarfs the annual cost. It makes that temporary short-run 1% GDP dip look completely negligible.
It's like taking a tiny, brief stock market dip to permanently increase the size of your national portfolio by up to 10% every year for 40 years.
That's why they call it a national growth cheat code.
It is.
But this brings up the central conflict between human capital investment and that common fear of tax drag. The argument that high taxes inherently kill growth, so this high tax, high spend model is self-defeating.
And while, sure, poorly designed taxes cause inefficiencies, the international evidence just does not support the idea that low tax automatically equals high growth,
Yeah.
especially if that low tax comes at the expense of human capital.
I mean, we can look at competitor nations that have done this. Denmark, Sweden, Finland. They spend a much higher percentage of their GDP on education than the UK has historically. What are they showing us?
They're showing us higher productivity, consistently higher real wages, better social mobility, and strong long-term growth. They've successfully combined a strong social state with world-leading economic dynamism.
So they prove it's possible.
They prove that high investment in human capital is the engine that lets them sustain a high-tax environment without sacrificing their competitiveness.
So the argument that we can't afford to invest because taxes are too high is kind of backward.
It's completely backward. And if you look at the UK model, with its decades of comparative underinvestment, that is undeniably reflected in our stagnant productivity, our declining social mobility, and the crisis of real wages. Our challenge is a growth problem caused by a failure to invest in people.
Okay, let's look at the counterfactual. If this investment offers such massive returns, what is the cost of doing nothing? Of maintaining today's funding levels? It's often presented as the safe, conservative option.
But as our sources say, doing nothing is not neutral. The cost of inaction is invisible, it's compounding, and it is absolutely toxic in the long term.
How so?
By maintaining the status quo, we guarantee immediate consequences. Accelerating teacher burnout, which hits learning quality, widening attainment gaps between rich and poor students. We also accrue massive structural maintenance debt.
Like the ongoing issues with crumbling school buildings.
Exactly. Whether it's RAAC-style concrete failures today or some other maintenance debt tomorrow, deferred capital spending eventually becomes a multi-billion-pound emergency bill. But the biggest cost of inaction is that persistent, invisible drag on the whole economy.
Lower productivity growth year after year.
Guaranteeing that long-term GDP is permanently 5 to 10% smaller than it could have been.
So the economy is always paying for poor education, either through the manageable direct cost of investment now or the vastly larger indirect cost of lower productivity later. And the latter is exponentially more expensive.
It creates a structural ceiling on prosperity.
So summarizing the returns of this high investment model, it's one of the few policies that simultaneously hits several huge structural targets.
It reduces inequality by lifting the floor for everyone. It raises sustained long-term growth through human capital. It improves population health outcomes. And ultimately, it strengthens the social fabric and the capacity for democracy by creating a more informed, more engaged populace.
So we took a deep dive into the calculus of funding education at the level of private provision. We saw the economic transition involves a short-term temporary adjustment, that 1% dip we talked about.
Driven by the tax funding mechanism, yeah.
But we established that this adjustment is merely a necessary step. It's what you do to unlock a permanent, structural, long-term economic return of 5 to 10% of GDP.
Effectively paying for the initial cost many, many times over and dramatically improving the nation's productive capacity.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the choice is, well, it seems pretty clear.
It's a structural decision. It's between having a slightly grumpy economy that adjusts now for decades of sustained prosperity, or maintaining the status quo and paying an invisible compounding cost that guarantees continued stagnation.
We've established the hard economic why of this investment. We've shown the payoff in GDP, productivity, wages. But we also touched on those massive non-monetary returns: health, democracy, reducing inequality. We want to leave you with a thought to consider, built right from the source material. What stands out to you as the single biggest non-monetary return of this kind of investment? Is it population health, the stability of democracy, or the generational impact on social mobility?